The morning of October 25, 1944, began quietly in the waters east of the Philippines. At 6:47 a.m., the calm ocean suddenly erupted into violence. High above the sea, a massive steel shell screamed through the air at more than 2,600 feet per second. It was fired from the guns of a Japanese battleship. The shell itself weighed almost as much as a small car. Seconds later, it struck its target. A bright white flash exploded across the bridge of an American warship. Metal tore apart. Smoke filled the air. Men were thrown across the deck, and in the middle of that chaos stood a naval officer who had already been badly wounded. Commander Ernest Evans, captain of the destroyer USS Johnston, had just lost part of his hand when the shell struck. Blood covered his uniform. His vision was blurred by smoke and shock. Most officers would have been carried below deck immediately. Evans refused. Instead, he wrapped the wound quickly with a bandage, walked back to the helm, and gave an order that shocked everyone on the ship: full speed ahead. But he did not order the ship to retreat. He ordered the destroyer to charge forward, directly toward the most powerful battleship ever built. The Japanese battleship Yamato displaced more than 70,000 tons of steel. Its main guns could fire shells over 18 miles away. Each shell could smash through thick armor that protected even the largest warships. The USS Johnston was a destroyer weighing barely 2,000 tons. It had thinner armor, smaller guns, and far fewer men. By every measurement used by naval experts, this battle should have lasted only minutes. Yet something strange happened in the waters near the island of Samar that morning. The small American ships did not run. They attacked, and by the time the battle ended, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled turned around and sailed away. Historians still debate exactly why that happened. But the truth begins long before that battle. To understand how a handful of small escort ships managed to confuse and damage a massive Japanese fleet, we have to go back several years to a completely different battlefield. Not in the Pacific, but in the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic. In 1940, the Second World War was entering one of its darkest moments. Germany had already conquered most of Western Europe. France had fallen. Britain stood alone against the power of Nazi Germany. But the greatest threat to Britain was not an invasion army. It was starvation. Britain depended heavily on supplies arriving by ship from North America: food, fuel, weapons, industrial materials. Everything the country needed to survive the war had to cross the Atlantic Ocean. German submarines, known as U-boats, were determined to stop those ships, and they were very good at it. Throughout 1940, German submarines sank Allied merchant ships faster than new ships could be built. In June 1940, more than 280,000 tons of shipping were destroyed. Just 3 months later, the number rose to nearly 300,000 tons in a single month. Convoys of merchant ships leaving ports like New York and Halifax often disappeared before reaching Britain. The sailors aboard them rarely survived. The Atlantic Ocean was brutally cold. Men thrown into the water often died within minutes. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later admitted something remarkable about those months of the war. He said the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire conflict was the German submarine campaign, because the math was simple. If Britain could not receive supplies, Britain would lose the war, not because German soldiers invaded the island, but because the country would slowly collapse without food and fuel. The Royal Navy desperately needed ships that could escort convoys across the Atlantic and protect them from submarines. But there was a serious problem. Most of the Royal Navy's destroyers were already assigned to other missions. Destroyers were fast and powerful warships designed to fight in large fleet battles. They were expensive. They took a long time to build, and there were not enough of them. What Britain needed was something different. A ship that could be built quickly. A ship that could patrol the ocean for long periods of time. A ship designed specifically to hunt submarines. But when the idea for such a ship was first proposed, many naval leaders rejected it immediately. They believed the concept was flawed. They believed the ships would be weak, and they believed building them would waste valuable resources. One American naval officer disagreed. His name was Captain Edward Cochrane. Cochrane was not famous. He was not a war hero. He was the kind of officer who spent more time studying technical problems than giving speeches. During a visit to London, Cochrane carefully studied the crisis happening in the Atlantic. He examined the reports of destroyed convoys. He spoke with British officers. He studied ship construction times, and eventually he came to a conclusion. The Allies did not need bigger ships. They needed more ships. Cochrane suggested building a new class of warship designed specifically for escort duty. These ships would be smaller than traditional destroyers. They would carry fewer guns. They would be slower, and they would cost far less money to produce. Naval leadership in the United States reviewed the proposal. The answer was almost immediate: no. Senior officers in the Bureau of Ships argued that standard destroyers could already perform escort missions. Building a separate class of smaller ships would only reduce overall combat power. From their perspective, the logic seemed obvious. Why build a weaker warship when you could build a stronger one? The proposal was rejected. For a short time, it appeared the idea would disappear completely. But events in the Atlantic were becoming worse every month, and soon the British government made a direct request to the United States. They needed escort ships urgently. Without them, the supply lines across the Atlantic might collapse. President Franklin Roosevelt reviewed the request. In August 1941, he made a decision that overruled the Navy's objections. The ships would be built. The new ships were called destroyer escorts. Compared to traditional fleet destroyers, they looked unimpressive. A fleet destroyer was around 375 feet long and capable of speeds close to 38 knots. A destroyer escort was smaller, slower, less heavily armed. On paper, the comparison was not flattering. Fleet destroyers carried 5 large guns. Destroyer escorts carried only 2. Fleet destroyers carried large torpedo batteries. Destroyer escorts had far fewer. To many naval officers, the new ship seemed like a compromise. Something built only because the war demanded quick solutions. But they had one enormous advantage: they could be built incredibly fast. While a fleet destroyer might take a year or more to construct, destroyer escorts could be completed in about 20 weeks. Some American shipyards began producing them at astonishing speed. In Houston, Texas, the Brown Shipbuilding Company eventually reached a production rate of 1 destroyer escort every week. Another shipyard in Massachusetts built more than 200 of them. Many workers there had never built warships before, but they learned quickly. Within a few years, hundreds of destroyer escorts were entering service. At first, their mission was simple: protect convoys, find submarines, destroy them. But something unexpected began happening once these ships entered combat. They were becoming extremely good at their job, and soon a new weapon would make them even more dangerous. For the first 2 years of the war, destroying submarines was frustratingly difficult. Most escort ships used depth charges. These were large explosive barrels dropped into the water behind a ship. They were set to explode at a certain depth. The idea was simple. If the explosion happened close enough to a submarine, the pressure would damage the hull. But the system had a serious weakness. To drop depth charges, the escort ship had to pass directly over the submarine. And when that happened, sonar contact was lost. The ship's own engines and propellers created too much noise. For a few critical seconds, the submarine commander could move. He could change depth. He could change direction. By the time the escort ship dropped its charges, the submarine might already be somewhere else. The results were disappointing. On average, it took about 60 depth charge attacks to sink a single submarine. That was not good enough. Then a British engineer developed a completely different weapon. It was called Hedgehog. Instead of dropping explosives behind the ship, Hedgehog fired 24 small projectiles forward. They landed in the water ahead of the ship in a circular pattern. And unlike depth charges, they only exploded when they actually struck a submarine. If they missed, nothing happened. No explosion, just silence. At first, many sailors disliked the weapon. When depth charges exploded, crews felt like they were accomplishing something. But Hedgehog was different. If the attack missed, the ocean remained quiet. But when it worked, the results were devastating, because contact explosions meant a direct hit. Soon the statistics told the story. Instead of 1 kill for every 60 attacks, Hedgehog achieved roughly 1 kill for every 5 attacks. It was one of the most effective anti-submarine weapons ever developed. And one American ship would soon prove just how powerful it could be. In 1944, a destroyer escort named USS England entered the Pacific Ocean. The ship was not famous. It was one of hundreds built during the war. But its crew had trained harder than most. One young officer aboard the ship believed Hedgehog could be used with incredible precision if the crew practiced enough. His name was Lieutenant John Williamson. Williamson drilled the crew constantly. Loading procedures, attack angles, sonar tracking. Over and over again, some officers believed the training was excessive, but Williamson insisted that perfect practice would save lives. Soon, the opportunity to prove his theory arrived. American intelligence discovered that the Japanese Navy had positioned a line of submarines across the Pacific. Their mission was to detect incoming American fleets. A small hunter-killer group was sent to destroy them. USS England was part of that group. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary anti-submarine operations in naval history. Because within the next 12 days, that single ship would destroy 6 enemy submarines, a record that still stands today. And that success would prove something important. The small ships that many admirals once dismissed as second-class vessels were becoming one of the most effective weapons of the entire war. But an even greater test was coming. Just 5 months later, those same ships would face something far more dangerous than submarines. They would face battleships, and the result would shock the world. By early 1944, hundreds of destroyer escorts were already operating across the Atlantic and the Pacific. Most of them performed the same duty every day. Escort convoys, search the ocean, listen for submarines, attack if one was found. It was slow, exhausting work. Days could pass without any knacked at all. Crews spent long hours staring at empty water and listening to the quiet pulses of sonar echoing through the ocean. But the sailors aboard one particular ship were doing something different. They were practicing over and over again. The ship was USS England, a Buckley-class destroyer escort commissioned in December 1943. Like many escort ships, she was relatively small compared to fleet destroyers. But the officers aboard her believed size did not matter nearly as much as preparation. The executive officer of the ship, Lieutenant John Williamson, had become deeply interested in the new Hedgehog weapon system. To him, it was not just another tool. It was a weapon that could completely change submarine warfare if it was used correctly. Most crews trained with Hedgehog only occasionally. Williamson insisted on constant drills. His sailors practiced loading the projectiles again and again. They practiced aiming procedures. They practiced calculating the exact moment when the weapon should be fired. Sometimes they practiced late into the night. Other ships in their escort group joked that England's crew was obsessed. Some officers quietly suggested that the training was unnecessary. Williamson disagreed. He believed something very simple. In battle, there would be no time to think. Only the habits formed during practice would matter. And if those habits were perfect, the ship would have an advantage that no specification sheet could measure. In May 1944, American naval intelligence intercepted a message that revealed an important Japanese plan. The Japanese Navy had placed a line of submarines across the western Pacific Ocean. Their mission was to detect American fleets preparing to invade the Mariana Islands. These submarines were not attacking ships directly. They were acting as scouts. If they spotted the American fleet early enough, the Japanese Navy Sea would prepare an ambush. Destroying that scouting line became extremely important. A small hunter-killer group was ordered to search the area. The group included several destroyer escorts: USS England, USS George, USS Raby. Their mission was simple: find the submarines, destroy them. At first, the ocean seemed empty. Days passed with nothing but waves and wind. But on May 19, 1944, everything changed. Shortly after sunrise, the sonar operator aboard USS England heard something unusual. A faint echo appeared on the sonar screen. It was not the shape of a whale or drifting debris. It was moving, slowly, steadily. The operator reported the contact immediately. Within seconds, the ship's bridge became quiet. Every man understood what the signal meant. A submarine was below them. Lieutenant Williamson quickly calculated the attack approach. The ship turned toward the target. The distance closed. 800 yards, 600 yards, 400 yards. The sonar signal became clearer with every second. Finally, the moment arrived. Williamson gave the order. Fire, Hedgehog. 24 small projectiles launched forward from the bow of the ship. They splashed into the water in a wide circular pattern ahead of the destroyer escort. Then there was silence. No explosion. just the quiet sound of the ocean. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then suddenly the sea erupted. A deep underwater explosion rolled through the water. The pressure wave shook the ship. The crew immediately understood what it meant. The Hedgehog had hit something solid. Moments later, debris began rising to the surface. Oil spread across the water. The submarine I-16 had been destroyed. Every member of its crew was lost, but the hunt was not finished. 3 days later, the hunter-killer group detected another submarine. This time it was RO-16. Once again, USS England began its attack run. The crew moved quickly. Training had turned every step into instinct. The Hedgehog launcher fired again. 2 salvos struck the submarine. Within minutes, the enemy vessel disappeared beneath the ocean. 2 submarines destroyed, but the patrol area still contained several more. On May 23rd, the escort group detected another submarine. This time, USS George and USS Raby made the first attacks. They launched multiple Hedgehog patterns. Nothing happened. The weapon splashed harmlessly into the sea. No explosions. No contact hits. The submarine was still there. Eventually, the command passed the attack to USS England. Williamson studied the sonar data carefully. Then he adjusted the approach slightly. The ship turned. The launcher fired. 2 salvos later, the submarine O-104 was destroyed. It was becoming clear that England's crew was achieving something unusual. Their accuracy was far higher than normal. The difference was not luck. It was practice. The pattern continued. On May 24th, another submarine surfaced unexpectedly. Radar detected it before it could dive. USS England attack. Ed immediately. 1 Hedgehog salvo, another kill. On May 26th, yet another submarine attempted to shadow the American ships. Radar spotted the disturbance on the ocean's surface. England attacked again. 1 salvo. The submarine broke apart beneath the water. 5 submarines had been destroyed in less than a week. Naval commanders began to notice. Destroying submarines was always difficult, but 1 small destroyer escort was doing it with astonishing efficiency. Then came the final submarine in the Japanese scouting line. The 6th submarine on May 31st, sonar detected RO-105. This time, the entire escort group participated in the attack. USS George attacked. USS Raby attacked. Another escort ship joined the hunt. 16 separate Hedgehog runs were attempted. None of them succeeded. Finally, USS England moved in. Williamson guided the ship into position. The sonar contact remained steady. The distance closed. The launcher fired. Seconds later, the ocean exploded with another violent detonation. Our O-105 had been destroyed. 6 submarines, 12 days. 1 ship. The record was unlike anything the U.S. Navy had seen before. News of the achievement quickly reached Washington. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest J. King, sent a message directly to the crew of USS England. It read, "There will always be an England in the United States Navy." It was one of the highest compliments the Navy could give. But the story did not end there, because the success of USS England proved something that many naval leaders had not expected. Destroyer escorts were not just useful, they were extremely effective. They were cheap, they were fast to build, and with the right training, they could destroy enemy submarines faster than traditional fleet destroyers, yet many senior officers still doubted them. They believed destroyer escorts were useful only for convoy protection. They were meant to fight powerful surface fleets. But only a few months later, the small ships would face a situation nobody had imagined. They would face battleships, and not just any battleships. The largest battleship ever built, the Yamato. The coming battle would test everything the destroyer escort program had proven so far: training, courage, technology, and the willingness of small ships to stand against overwhelming force. The result would become one of the most dramatic naval battles of the entire Second World War, and it would happen in the waters off a small Philippine island called Samar. By October 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical moment. American forces were preparing to invade the Philippines, a strategic island chain that Japan had controlled for years. If the United States captured these islands, Japanese supply routes would be cut apart. For Japan, losing the Philippines would be catastrophic. So the Japanese Navy created one last desperate plan. It was called Operation Show Go. The idea was bold, dangerous, and extremely complicated. Several Japanese fleets would move toward the Philippines from different directions. Some of these fleets were meant to act as bait, drawing American carriers away from the real attack force. The real strike force was incredibly powerful. It included some of the largest warships ever built, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and the most famous battleship in the world, Yamato. Yamato was a floating fortress. Displacing over 70,000 tons, it was the largest battleship ever constructed. Its main guns were enormous 18.1-inch cannons, capable of firing shells weighing more than 3,000 pounds. Each shell could travel nearly 20 miles. Against most ships in the world, Yamato was unstoppable. And now this massive fleet was sailing toward the American invasion forces near the island of Leyte. If it reached the vulnerable trans, port ships, and escort carriers supporting the landing, the result could be devastating. Thousands of soldiers could be stranded, entire fleets could be destroyed. But something unexpected stood in their path, a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers. The American group was known as Taffy 3. It was not designed to fight a major naval battle. Its mission was simply to provide air support for soldiers fighting on land. The group included 6 small escort aircraft carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyers, escorts, compared to the Japanese fleet approaching them. This force was tiny. Escort carriers were slow and lightly armored. Their aircraft were mostly designed for ground attack missions, not naval combat. The destroyers and escort ships were even smaller. They were built to protect convoys, not to fight battleships. Early on the morning of October 25, 1944, lookouts on one of the escort carriers saw something alarming on the horizon, tall columns of water rising into the sky. Moments later, radar confirmed the terrifying truth. A massive Japanese fleet had appeared suddenly through a gap in the American defenses. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. The ships of Taffy 3 were completely exposed. The nearest American fleet carriers were hundreds of miles away. For a moment, the situation looked hopeless. Then the commander of one destroyer made a decision that would become legendary. Commander Ernest Evans, captain of the destroyer USS Johnston, understood the situation immediately. This small ship had no chance of defeating the Japanese fleet, but he also knew something important. If the Japanese ships continued forward without resistance, they would reach the escort carriers very quickly. Those carriers were slow. They could not escape. Evans gathered his crew on the ship's intercom. His voice was calm but direct. He told them something simple. A large Japanese fleet has been contacted, and they are coming this way. Then he gave the order. Instead of retreating, USS Johnston accelerated directly toward the enemy. It was an almost unbelievable decision. The destroyer weighed barely 2,100 tons. The Japanese battleships ahead of them weighed more than 30 times that amount. But the small ship surged forward. As Johnston closed the distance, the Japanese ships opened fire. Massive shells screamed across the sky. Water exploded around the destroyer as huge columns of spray shot upward. Yet Johnston kept charging. At around 10,000 yards, Evans ordered the torpedoes launched. The destroyer fired a spread of 10 torpedoes toward the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. Moments later, a powerful explosion tore through the cruiser's bow. The front section of the massive ship was blown apart. Kumano was forced to withdraw from the battle. A tiny destroyer had just crippled a major Japanese warship. The sudden attack stunned the Japanese commanders. They had expected the American ships to run. Instead, they were charging. And Johnston was not alone. Other destroyers soon joined the attack. USS Whale raced forward to launch torpedoes. USS Heermann followed close behind. Even the smaller destroyer escorts began firing their guns. These ships were not designed to fight battleships. Their guns were far smaller. Their armor was almost non-existent, but they attacked anyway. They laid down thick smoke screens to hide the escort carriers. They fired torpedoes whenever an opportunity appeared. They maneuvered aggressively, forcing the Japanese ships to turn and avoid potential torpedo hits. Each maneuver slowed the Japanese advance. Each delay gave the escort carriers more time to escape. Meanwhile, aircraft from the carriers began launching into the sky. Many of them carried only small bombs or machine guns. Some carried nothing at all, but they attacked anyway. Pilots flew directly toward the Japanese fleet, diving repeatedly to distract the enemy gunners. Some aircraft even made fake attack runs when they had no ammunition left. The goal was simple: confuse the enemy, buy time. During the battle, USS Johnston took heavy damage. Several large shells struck the ship. One explosion destroyed part of the engine room. Another hit the bridge. Commander Evans himself was seriously wounded, but he refused to abandon the fight. Even after losing power temporarily, the crew managed to restart the engines. The destroyer returned to the battle again and again. At one point, Johnston attacked a group of Japanese destroyers at close range. The small American ship fired every weapon it had left. The battle had become chaotic. Smoke filled the air. Ships maneuvered wildly. Aircraft attacked from above. Japanese commanders struggled to understand what they were facing. From their perspective, the American resistance seemed far stronger than expected. They believed they might be confronting a much larger fleet. After nearly 2 hours of intense fighting, the Japanese fleet still had not reached the escort carriers. They had taken unexpected damage. Several cruisers were disabled. Ships had been forced to maneuver repeatedly to avoid torpedoes, and aircraft attacks continued to harass them from above. The commander of the Japanese fleet, Admiral Tako Kurita, faced a difficult decision. He had entered the battle expecting weak resistance. Instead, he found fierce, aggressive attacks coming from every direction. His ships had already suffered losses. More American aircraft could arrive at any moment. If the fleet continued forward, it might sail directly into a larger American trap. After a brief discussion with his staff, Kurita made a surprising decision. He ordered the fleet to turn around. The massive Japanese force began withdrawing from the battle. The small American ships had survived, and somehow they had forced one of the most powerful naval fleets in history to retreat. The victory did not come without sacrifice. Several American ships were lost during the battle. USS Johnston eventually sank after taking heavy damage. Commander Ernest Evans was last seen standing on the deck of his ship as it went down. He never survived the battle. Other destroyers and escort ships were also lost, but their actions had saved the escort carriers, and more importantly, they had protected the vulnerable transport ships supporting the invasion of the Philippines. Historians later called the Battle of Samar one of the most courageous naval actions ever fought. A handful of small ships had faced battleships and cruisers many times their size, and they had refused to retreat. The battle proved something that naval experts had underestimated for years. Size and firepower are not the only factors that determine victory at sea. Several elements played a crucial role. Training. The crews of destroyers and escort ships were highly trained. Their ability to react quickly and coordinate attacks created confusion in the enemy fleet. Aggression. Japanese commanders expected weak resistance. Instead, they faced fearless attacks from ships that should have been retreating. Torpedoes and smoke screens. Even small ships carried dangerous weapons. Torpedoes forced larger ships to maneuver defensively, slowing their advance. Aircraft harassment. Even lightly armed planes kept constant pressure on the Japanese fleet. Together, these factors created a powerful illusion. The Japanese fleet believed they might be facing a much larger American force, and that uncertainty was enough to change the outcome of the battle. After the war, the story of Taffy 3 became legendary among naval historians. Many experts still describe the Battle off Samar as one of the most unlikely victories in naval history. Ships that were originally built as simple convoy escorts had proven something extraordinary. With the right leadership and determination, even the smallest warships could challenge the giants of the sea. The destroyer escorts that many admirals once dismissed as second-class ships had become symbols of courage and resilience, and the story of ships like USS England and USS Johnston continues to inspire sailors even today. Because on that morning in October 1944, when the largest battleship fleet in the world appeared on the horizon, a few small ships made a decision that changed history. They did not run, they attacked, and against all expectations, they won.